I might sound really biased with some of the things that I say, but we can all agree that the core element and the key to make Devil May Cry successful is gameplay and its replay value. Already from the trailer, we can see that Nero has similar movesets with those in his debut in Devil May Cry 4. Compared to Dante, Nero's combat was a lot simpler, but there's nothing wrong with that, because it gives accessibility for the casual audience while keeping and maintaining the style that Devil May Cry 3 and 4 are known for. Cause for me personally, Dante was a really hard character to get into in terms of using his full potential and being really stylish with it. Aside from his grapple attacks, Nero only ever had one melee and one ranged weapon, so there was less to memorize. His Devil Trigger also complemented his limited moveset, but with extra flair and kept learning curve to a minimum. But with Dante, it can be hard at times to keep the enemy grounded or suspended for combos while trying to make use of his full arsenal. Throughout the many years of Devil May Cry 3 and 4, there are a lot of combo videos created by the community. And for me, reaching that level is very difficult. There are a few hidden mechanics within the games, but most of it comes down to being able to memorize all of Dante's movesets and practicing his weapon and style rotations and quick execution. Playing Dante for the first time can be a bit overwhelming for newcomers, and that's why Nero's simpler design is key in balancing out different player levels. But when you're able to reach that level of play with Dante and create endless unique combos, it's incredible just how far each player can push the game to its limits. And the option to have a character like Nero, simpler in design but just as badass, and Dante, a character with a steeper learning curve but endless potential, is something I would like kept in the new Devil May Cry game. And if the trailer is anything to go by, and if it does play like 3 and 4, I would really like the lock-on system returning. I really respect the reboot for what it tried to do without it, but I like having a lock-on system because it felt like you had more control and accuracy in exactly what you wanted. One problem I had in the reboot was not being able to target the exact enemy I wanted to go for. Sure, you could eliminate a button for locking on, and a lot of the skirmishes were easy enough because they're well spread apart, right? But you still had to play around with the camera a bit and hope that the direction you're pointing in was the correct angle for the specific enemy you wanted. And personally, I just prefer the control scheme of having a targeted enemy no matter where I go in a fight, especially in a game like Devil May Cry. And please, no color-coded enemies this time. The whole angel and demon weapons, the Nephilim theme, was a pretty fun idea, but not in terms of combat where enemies only responded to certain weapons. It really restricts the freedom of combat, the way we wanted to fight, rather than providing the players with strategic battles and something to think about. I understand where the developers wanted to go for. It was cool for the first enemy, but you realize just how stale the combat is because they deflect every other attack but the correct one, and your style potential is zero. It's boring to have to keep using one or the other weapon because the game says so. Devil May Cry combat, especially with Dante and Virgil, they look best and play best when you're utilizing everything you have. God of War is the exact same thing. The game gives you such badass weapons and spells, but they're all completely optional, and it just comes down to how the player wants to play. When you're forced to use a weapon you may not particularly enjoy, it's a huge chore. An enemy having a shield which deflects attacks, which is pretty much the purpose of the shield, is not the same thing as enemies only being hit by certain weapons. And going into Devil Trigger, I'm really hoping that it goes back into the roots, the same Devil Trigger that we had in 1, 2, 3, and 4. The problem with the one in the reboot is that it was a huge crowd controlling mechanism, almost a Deus Ex Machina when you needed a clutch. While you do get free damage, and the sound effects were nice, that's about it. The regular Devil Trigger gave you slight health regeneration, damage buff, a lot of armor and poise, which is super important to have when you are fighting multiple enemies that were overly aggressive. You had more room to play with, but it still kept the player in control and the enemies still doing what they do best, trying to kill you. The players didn't need a freebie where you're basically suspending all the enemies beside you and you're getting free damage. Lots of free damage. It was too easy, it made the game brain dead and you're just mashing one button trying to kill them fast. Also in Devil May Cry 3, you could hold your Devil Trigger button and charge it for an exploding attack. The longer the charge, provided you have the DT filled up, the stronger the burst. And I remember in Devil May Cry 2, when you were in critical health, you turned into Dante's Majin form, basically a god. And that was a blast. Literally. But that's not all. Devil May Cry 3 also had uses of DT outside the transformation. You had Quicksilver, which slows down time, and Doppelganger as styles to choose from. Choosing either or did replace one of the 4 main styles, but it gave so much more replay value against certain enemies. Nero looks like he has minor Quicksilver mechanics just from the trailer, but I'm hoping that Dante has options too and the third playable character, just outside their typical transformations. And in Devil May Cry 5, since Nero works off his prosthetic arm, I can see his abilities using certain amounts of his gauge, rather than having a transformation that drains it. Imagine Lady in Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition where she spends all her meter for one strong attack. Depending on how much is filled up, the stronger the attack. And talking about Devil Trigger, a key feature I would like returning is the taunting system. It's completely optional and not everybody uses it, but the reward for pulling off a taunt, which lasts anywhere between like 2 to 4 seconds, right, in combat, is very satisfying to have, especially when facing a boss like Doppelganger, because you optimize the fight to burn all your DT to maximize DPS, right, and you end up rebuilding a small portion at the end of the DPS cycle. Because by normal means, Devil Trigger is pretty slow to rebuild, and it's not something the game really wants you to use every fight on full maximum charge, only when you need it. And speaking of Doppelganger, lots of bosses please. I really love the boss fights in Devil May Cry 3, so I would really appreciate Devil May Cry 5 if it came with an abundance of unique bosses. I will give it to Devil May Cry 4 in terms of combat because they polished it, but more importantly gave Dante access to all his weapons and styles without having you to switch them before the mission or during, through the shrines. But Devil May Cry 3 had so many bosses that were challenging in their own way. You had the Doggo, the Hentai Monster 1, Royal Guard Exhibition, Fam, Hentai Monster 2, Bay, Dio, Fam, the Waifu, Shadow Link, your mom, and Fam. Oh, and Arkham. Now, Devil May Cry 4 had this guy. Pretty lit. Feels bad, man. My guilty pleasure. Overly protective brother. Hide your wives.
Look, up in the sky, it's a bird.
It's a plane!
It's John C.
And Father, I have sinned. It's still a bit, but not as many as I'd like. And I hated how you could only fight Kratos with Dante through Bloody Palace. Cause Kratos was a very cool boss because of his defense mechanisms. Dante with his Royal Guard was essentially a counter on his counter, but the only way to practice the matchup was reaching floor 80, PC mods aside. Devil May Cry 3 had a huge mystical tower with many floors you were constantly exploring, some areas twice due to key items and new access points. Half of Devil May Cry 4 was in one direction, and the other half with Dante was in reverse. I understood it from a story perspective, but it felt like a cop-out because there was potential to add more diverse enemies and boss fights rather than repeating them just with a different character. In the special edition of Devil May Cry 3, which came out shortly after the original, you got to play as Virgil but with the same levels and missions as Dante did. They did insert unique cutscenes just to sort of add him into the story, but the progression of the game played out the same, which I had no problem with. You would fight the exact same bosses, the exact same enemies, and just go through the exact same game, but just with a different character. When you have multiple characters in a game like Devil May Cry, where the game is segmented into missions, do you separate and give each character unique missions and boss fights, or have it shared throughout all characters? Like in Devil May Cry 4, Nero confronts Dante and Kratos during the story, but when you play as Dante, you don't fight back Nero or you don't fight Kratos. I wouldn't mind if Devil May Cry 5 is like the special editions, where you can try the exact same mission but with another character. But from a story standpoint, I can see how lost it can be and how undermining certain characters feel, because certain events you're playing in are not for your respective character story-wise. It's a hard thing to balance and cater to, but if the characters had exclusive missions and boss fights, maybe the game could have a boss rush mode or arena mode. Bloody Palace is also available, but the downside is going through waves of enemies just to reach the boss, and if you die on the way there, you have to start again. Also in Devil May Cry 4, you never fight the savior, like his entire phase and sequence, with Nero. So that was a little bit of a missed opportunity, because I would have liked to see what Nero's options would have been. In terms of story though, I'm not expecting a huge crazy development throughout the characters. Dante already had his moments throughout the franchise, and everybody just loves him where he is with 3 and 4, and I do too. And you know how strong he is and how fun he makes fighting because of his laid-back attitude despite all odds. Nero grew a lot in power level, but I think there's still a lot of untouched material they could go from there. Let's say the hooded figure is Virgil. You could have that father and son moment that the Devil May Cry franchise never had, you know, cause Sparta died out long time ago, so it was just Dante and Virgil. But then if you have Virgil and his son, but then Dante is also the uncle, how does the family work with the 3 of them? I wanna know more. And if it is Virgil, what happened to Virgil at the end of number 1? Was he just isolated from society all these years? Does he still have his power? Is that why he needs Nero's arm to get back Yamato? Does he remember being Mundus' pet? There's so many questions, but I'll be patient about it. But when you look at the three badass characters, Nero, Dante, and Virgil, these guys require an exceptional villain to be able to even put them in danger. The problem is, Dante shrugs off everything because he's such a badass. Nero loses at times, but he comes back stronger, and Virgil is just Virgil. I mean, they're gonna be badass either way. However, a really well-written villain just makes the heroes shine even more. So here's hoping for a villain that really puts them on the edge. So let me know if you guys agree or disagree with some of the things that I brought up, because the game comes out in spring 2019. There's a lot of time to just think about it and just, you know, get hyped for it, right? Everybody's gonna have a little bit of different features and mechanics that they want returning or removed. Oh, and I forgot about Kirie. Please, no Kirie.
I am still alive, right?
I acknowledge that she's in the game because Nero tells her to hide in the trailer. I don't have a problem with the character wanting to protect those they love. The problem with Kirie is that she's a very flat character personality-wise and is not interesting enough for us to sympathize with Nero and to get into the role of a rescuer in the game.
I don't know anyone who is as human as you are.
The potential father-son dynamic, Virgil having torn his arm off, is more than enough motivation to fight through the apocalypse in search for answers.
So, this is what they call a heartwarming family reunion, eh?
You got that right.
And if you think about it, in Devil May Cry 4, the entire Order was trying to save Nero by taking him away from Kirie. They are the true savior.
Think on that.
Real life is not like the stories our father told us. You were a fool for believing it so.
Oh, and I would like Lady and Trish returning because, you know, plot.
Well, then it's settled.
Come on, babes. Let's rock.